So there I was, handcuffed in my own driveway at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday night after working a 14-hour shift in 118-degree heat while my neighbor, Brenda Kensington, stood there with her iPhone out, filming my arrest like she'd just caught a serial killer. 3 squad cars, flashing lights turning my quiet street into a circus. The entire HOA board lined up on my lawn like I was public enemy number 1. My work truck still running, air conditioning blasting because I'd literally just pulled in from an emergency call saving some poor family's AC during a Phoenix heat wave. And there's Brenda, practically orgasmic with joy, waving these official-looking papers at the deputy, screeching about how I'm a criminal who owes thousands in unpaid HOA fines and how she finally has proof of my violations. The steel handcuffs bit into my wrists, while the smell of hot asphalt and diesel fumes filled the air. Here's the kicker. Those unpaid bills she was so excited about, every single one had her name printed right there on the original documents. But here's what I want to know. What would you have done if your neighbor tried to have you arrested over her own unpaid bills? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight because this revenge story gets absolutely insane. Let me back up and tell you how this whole nightmare started, because you need the full picture to understand just how diabolical this woman really was. My name's Marcus Thorne, I'm 34, and I fix air conditioners for a living in the oven that Arizona calls summer. After my divorce, let's just say my ex had champagne tastes and left me with a beer budget, I scraped together enough for a down payment on this modest ranch house in Willowbrook Estates, just outside Tucson. Nothing fancy. We're talking 1990s subdivision where the American dream comes with beige stucco, drought-resistant rocks instead of grass, and neighbors who think excitement is a new flavor of Greek yogurt. The HOA formed in 2018, mostly to keep people from turning their front yards into junkyards. Enter our villain, Brenda Kensington. 59 years old, moved in 6 months after me from some fancy Scottsdale neighborhood where the golf carts cost more than my truck. Word was her husband's import business crashed harder than a meteor, forcing them into what she clearly considered peasant territory. Picture this. Bleached blonde bob that probably required monthly sacrifice to the hair gods, designer sunglasses bigger than satellite dishes, though I'd bet money they were knockoffs, and this perpetual look like she'd just smelled something offensive, which, considering she was surrounded by us working-class folks, probably wasn't far from the truth. She drove a silver Mercedes C-Class that screamed, "I'm still important," while making payments that probably kept her up at night. Meanwhile, I'm rolling around in my white Ford work van, tools rattling like a paint mixer having an epileptic fit every time I hit a pothole. The crunch of gravel under my work boots that first morning should have been my warning. I'd worked until midnight fixing some family's AC during a heat wave, because in Arizona, no air conditioning equals possible death, and I parked my van in my own driveway like a normal human being. Next morning, there's this citation under my windshield wiper, crackling in that bone-dry desert wind. $75 for commercial vehicle storage violation. Professional letterhead, legal jargon, the whole intimidation package. Here's where Brenda made her first mistake. I actually read the fine print. Called the property management company during lunch. Sandra, the office manager, goes quiet when I read the citation number. "Sir, we didn't issue any violations this week, and our bylaws don't even mention commercial vehicles." Legal nugget time. Always demand to see the original governing documents when someone hits you with HOA violations. Real enforcement requires proper documentation trails and authorized signatures. So I dug out my HOA paperwork, that thrilling novel they make you initial 50 times when you buy. Guess what? Zero mention of work trucks, commercial vehicles, or anything related to how I make my living. That's when the pieces clicked. Brenda was running a solo operation, creating fake violations with enough official polish to fool most people. She was targeting newer residents and anyone who looked like they might not fight back. Basically anyone who wasn't a retired accountant with too much time and a subscription to LegalZoom. The smell of motor oil and refrigerant was still clinging to my shirt as I stood there, holding this bogus citation, realizing my quiet post-divorce life just got hijacked by a wannabe HOA dictator with a grudge against people who work for a living. But here's what really got me. This wasn't just about me. If Brenda was willing to forge official documents and intimidate one neighbor, how many others was she targeting? How many people had already paid these fake fines just to avoid the hassle? The distant hum of air conditioning units working overtime filled the afternoon air, the sound of honest work keeping families comfortable in brutal heat. And somewhere in that suburban silence, I could practically hear Brenda plotting her next move. She was about to learn that messing with someone who crawls through 130-degree attics for a living was a very bad idea. 3 days later, Brenda made her first real power play, and honestly, I should have seen it coming from a mile away. I get home from a service call around 7 p.m. Nothing crazy, just replaced a capacitor for an elderly couple whose system was struggling in the heat, and there's this folded paper stuck to my front door. Not tucked politely in the mailbox, mind you, taped right to the door like some kind of eviction notice. Emergency HOA board meeting, Thursday 7 p.m., regarding Marcus Thorne violations. Emergency? I'd been living there all of 3 months, and the most exciting thing that had happened was Mrs. Patterson's cat getting stuck in a palm tree. But apparently I was now considered a neighborhood crisis worthy of emergency intervention. The meeting was held in the community center, which smelled like that particular blend of industrial carpet cleaner and broken dreams that you find in every suburban gathering space. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps having a turf war. I walked in expecting maybe the 5 board members and Brenda. Instead, I found what looked like a tribunal from hell. Brenda had recruited backup. There's Doris Fleming, this sweet 78-year-old from 3 houses down, looking nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. Poor Doris kept fidgeting with her purse strap like it was a rosary. Board President Jerry Walsh, retired insurance adjuster who takes Robert's Rules of Order more seriously than the 10 Commandments, called the meeting to order while Brenda sat there with this manila folder thick enough to stop bullets, practically vibrating with excitement. "We're here," Jerry announced in his most official voice, "to address ongoing violations and disruptive behavior by Mr. Thorne." Brenda jumped up like she'd been shot from a cannon. "He's been parking that commercial vehicle in violation of our aesthetic standards for weeks. And the noise violations, coming home at all hours, slamming doors, revving engines. Mrs. Fleming can attest to the intimidating behavior." She starts pulling papers from her folder like a magician doing card tricks. Violation notices, complaint forms, even what looked like a petition with signatures that probably came from the same hand that writes grocery lists in purple ink. Now here's something I learned from my divorce lawyer, and trust me, that education cost me enough to fund a small country's defense budget. Always demand to see the original documentation before you respond to any legal-sounding nonsense. So while Brenda was performing her one-woman Broadway show, I'd been busy with my phone taking time-stamped photos of every document she waved around. "Before we continue," I said, standing up with my own folder, much thinner but way more legitimate, "I'd like to see the specific bylaw that defines aesthetic standards for commercial vehicles." Dead silence. You could hear Jerry's stomach growling because he'd clearly missed dinner for this circus. Jerry started flipping through his copy of the HOA rules, looking more confused by the minute. "Well, there's the general provision about maintaining property values." "Which says what exactly about work trucks?" More silence. The air conditioning kicked on with a wheeze that suggested it needed my professional attention. That's when I pulled out my phone and showed them the photos I'd taken earlier that day of Brenda's own property. Cracked driveway that looked like a geological survey map. Dead plants in her front yard that were basically plant skeletons wearing price tags from Home Depot. And my personal favorite, her mailbox was hanging off its post at such an angle that the mail carrier probably needed an engineering degree and hazard pay to deliver her bills. "Since we're talking about aesthetic standards," I said, "maybe we should address these actual violations before creating imaginary ones." Brenda's face went through more color changes than a mood ring having a nervous breakdown. "That's completely different. This is about your aggressive behavior and—" "Ma'am," Jerry interrupted, and I could see the light bulb finally flickering on in his head like a dying fluorescent tube. "Do you have documentation that Mr. Thorne has actually violated any specific bylaw?" That's when poor Doris dropped the bombshell that changed everything. Turns out she'd been taking notes during Brenda's recruitment visit, and when Jerry asked her directly about my intimidating behavior, she looked like she wanted to crawl under the folding table. "I just signed what she asked me to sign because she seemed so upset," Doris whispered, her voice barely audible over the rattling air vents. "But honestly, that young man has always been polite when I see him. She told me he was probably dealing drugs, but I've never seen anything suspicious. I think she just doesn't like working people." The room temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees. Brenda's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for water. The meeting fell apart faster than a dollar store umbrella in a hurricane. Jerry called for a recess while the board huddled in the corner, whispering like conspirators planning a very boring coup. When they came back, Jerry looked like he'd rather be getting a root canal. Due to procedural irregularities, we're tabling this matter pending further review. But here's where Brenda showed her true colors. As everyone filed out, she cornered Jerry and suggested they impose a $25 monthly monitoring fee on my property until my compliance could be verified. $25 might not sound like much, but it was the principle. This woman was literally trying to tax me for existing in my own neighborhood. Walking back to my truck, I could smell that desert sage mixing with the lingering scent of whatever industrial disinfectant they used to make the community center smell like a hospital's waiting room. Doris caught up with me in the parking lot, her shoes crunching on the gravel. "I'm sorry about all this," she said quietly. "That woman made it sound like you were some kind of criminal. She's got a real problem with people who work with their hands." That's when I realized this wasn't going to end with one meeting. Brenda had tasted blood, and she was just getting started. 2 weeks later, Brenda decided to bring in the nuclear option. And by nuclear, I mean she called the county and told them I was running a meth lab. Okay, maybe not a meth lab, but close enough. I'm under the hood of my truck one Saturday morning, replacing a belt that had been squealing like my ex-wife during our custody negotiations, when this white county pickup rolls into my driveway. Out steps this guy in a polo shirt with a clipboard. And let me tell you, nothing good ever comes from a man with a clipboard and government credentials. "Marcus Thorne?" he asks, like he's about to serve me with papers. "That's me," I say, wiping grease off my hands with a shop rag that's probably older than some of the tools in my truck. "I'm Inspector Davidson, Maricopa County Code Enforcement. We received a complaint that you're operating an unlicensed commercial business from this residential property." The smell of motor oil mixed with that bone-dry Arizona heat hit me like a physical slap. Someone had actually called the county and reported me for, what exactly? Existing while blue-collar? "What kind of business are we talking about?" I asked, genuinely fascinated by whatever creative fiction Brenda had pitched to these people. Davidson flips through his paperwork like he's reading my criminal charges. "Unlicensed HVAC repair operation, commercial equipment storage, customer vehicles regularly on the property, excessive noise from power tools, and," he squints at his notes, "possible hazardous material storage." Hazardous materials? I looked around my perfectly normal suburban driveway. Where exactly are these customer vehicles and hazardous materials? That's what I'm here to investigate. You could see the confusion spreading across his face like spilled coffee when he realized my commercial operation consisted of one work truck, a garage with lawn equipment, and absolutely zero evidence of anything remotely business-related. "So you don't operate a repair business from this address?" he asked, pen poised over his clipboard. "Unless you count repairing my own sanity after dealing with crazy neighbors, then no." Davidson spent the next 30 minutes walking around my property like he was investigating a crime scene, taking photos of my empty garage, my tool-free driveway, and my complete lack of customer vehicles or hazardous materials. The man looked increasingly like someone who'd been sent to hunt unicorns. Here's something I learned from dealing with bureaucrats during my divorce proceedings. They hate wasting time on bogus complaints almost as much as they hate the people who file them. Davidson's expression went from official business to genuinely annoyed when I explained Brenda's fake violation campaign. "Mr. Thorne," he finally says, closing his clipboard with a definitive snap. "Not only is there no evidence of commercial activity here, but filing false reports with county code enforcement is a Class 1 misdemeanor. Someone's wasting taxpayer resources." After Davidson left, with a promise to flag any future complaints from my address as potentially frivolous, I realized Brenda had just made a critical error. She'd escalated to government agencies, which meant there was now an official paper trail of her harassment. That afternoon, I started my own investigation. Remember how my divorce taught me about documentation? Well, those expensive lessons were about to pay dividends. I took a neighborhood walk with my phone, camera ready, documenting not just property conditions, but talking to people about their own Brenda experiences. What I discovered would have made a fraud investigator weep with joy. Janet Mueller, 2 streets over, showed me Brenda's $150 fine for unauthorized landscaping modifications. Janet's crime? She'd planted tomatoes in her own backyard. The citation looked official enough to fool most people, complete with fake case numbers and legal-sounding language. Bob Richardson got hit for $200 for replacing his warped front door with an identical model. Brenda called it architectural modifications without board approval. Bob, being a retired accountant, had actually read the HOA bylaws and knew it was garbage, but the paperwork looked legitimate enough to worry his wife. But here's where things got really interesting, and this is where Brenda's greed finally tripped her up. I met Lisa Santos, a single mom who'd moved in 6 months ago and was still learning the neighborhood dynamics. She'd actually paid one of Brenda's fake fines. Paid it how? I asked. Mailed a check for $75 to the address she gave me, some P.O. box for HOA violation processing. The desert wind kicked up, sending dust devils dancing across the asphalt and rattling the palm fronds overhead with a sound like shuffling cards. That's when everything clicked into place. This wasn't just harassment, this was straight-up fraud. Brenda was collecting real money for fake violations and pocketing it herself. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Your employer has been contacted about your illegal business activities. Stop harassing senior residents or there will be serious consequences. I looked up from my phone toward Brenda's house 3 doors down. Her silver Mercedes was parked in the driveway, and I swear I saw a curtain twitch in the front window like she was watching my reaction. That's when I realized this woman had just handed me the evidence I needed to destroy her. She'd escalated to government agencies, committed fraud, and now she was threatening me via text message. The gloves, as they say, were officially off, and Brenda had no idea she'd just declared war on someone who'd learned to fight dirty in divorce court. Monday morning, 6:47 a.m. I'm loading my truck for what I thought would be a normal day when 2 police cruisers pull up to my house like I'm running a cartel instead of fixing broken thermostats. Out steps Officer Martinez, looking like he'd rather be directing traffic than dealing with whatever suburban drama had landed on his desk. Behind him, his partner keeps one hand near his radio. Apparently, I'm considered a potential threat to society. Marcus Thorne? That's me, I say, setting down my toolbox and wondering what fresh fiction Brenda had fed to Phoenix's finest this time. We need you to come downtown for questioning regarding a criminal threat incident that occurred yesterday evening. Criminal threats? Yesterday evening, I was home in my underwear, eating leftover Chinese food and watching a documentary about penguin migration. Unless threatening to change the channel had become a felony, I was genuinely baffled. What kind of threats are we talking about? Martinez flips through his notebook, and I can tell by his expression that he's not entirely sold on this whole situation. Brenda Kensington filed a report claiming you approached her on her property around 8 p.m., made verbal threats against her safety, and displayed aggressive behavior consistent with stalking. The morning air carried that familiar scent of creosote and dust that defines Arizona summers, mixing with the exhaust from the patrol cars. My brain was doing mathematical gymnastics trying to figure out how I'd manage to threaten someone while simultaneously being 40 miles away replacing a broken heat pump. Here's something they don't teach you in school but should. HVAC technicians are basically walking alibis. Every service call gets GPS tracked, time-stamped, and documented like we're conducting space missions instead of fixing air conditioners. Yesterday at 8 p.m., I was in Chandler installing a new condenser unit for the Johnson family, and I had enough paperwork to prove it beyond any reasonable doubt. 25 minutes later, I'm sitting in interview room B at the sheriff's office, which smells like industrial coffee and crushed hopes. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like dying insects while Martinez spread out my work orders, GPS tracking data, and customer signatures across the metal table. Mr. Thorne, Martinez says, looking up from what essentially amounted to my electronic alibi. According to these records, you were nowhere near Willowbrook Estates when this alleged incident occurred. In fact, you've got our customer signature confirming you were at their residence until 9:20 p.m. That's correct, officer. Martinez leans back in his chair and I can see the gears turning. This isn't the first complaint we've received about you from Ms. Kensington, is it? That's when I told him everything. The fake HOA violations, the fraudulent code enforcement complaint, the escalating pattern of harassment that had been building for months. Martinez took notes, asked pointed questions, and gradually transformed from suspicious cop to interested investigator. Here's what's going to happen, he said, closing his notebook with a definitive snap. No charges will be filed because, frankly, it's impossible to threaten someone when you're 40 miles away with GPS proof. But, Mr. Thorne, this is the 4th complaint we've received from Ms. Kensington in 6 weeks. 3 about you, 1 about another neighbor. We're starting to recognize a pattern. When I got home that afternoon, Janet Mueller flagged me down before I could even park. She'd organized an impromptu neighborhood meeting in her driveway, and apparently half the street had Brenda stories to share. Bob Richardson, retired accountant and spreadsheet wizard, had been busy. "I've compiled every fake violation she's issued over the past 18 months, he said, showing us a document that would make forensic accountants weep with joy. 14 different households, 47 separate violations, attempted collections totaling $3,400. But here's where Brenda's greed finally caught up with her, and this was the moment everything changed. Lisa Santos brought something that made my divorce lawyer's voice echo in my head: always follow the money trail. She pulled out her canceled check and the payment instructions Brenda had provided. The check wasn't made out to Willowbrook Estates HOA or our management company. It was made out to Community Standards Processing, LLC, and mailed to a P.O. box registered under, wait for it, B. Kensington. "She created a fake company," Bob said, his accountant brain practically smoking from excitement. "This isn't harassment anymore. This is wire fraud, mail fraud, and identity theft." The sound of sprinklers kicking on across the neighborhood mixed with the distant rumble of afternoon traffic as we stood there realizing we'd stumbled onto something that would make white-collar crime investigators dance with joy. My phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number. "You people are playing with fire. Drop this investigation or you'll regret it." I held up the phone so everyone could see the message. "And now we have witness intimidation to add to the list." That evening, Detective Rodriguez from Financial Crimes called me personally. Turns out when you file false police reports while simultaneously running a mail fraud operation, you tend to attract the attention of people with badges and very little sense of humor. "Bring everything you've got tomorrow," Rodriguez said. "Every fake violation, every payment instruction, every threatening message. We're opening a formal investigation." As the desert sunset painted my windows gold and crimson, I sat at my kitchen table organizing evidence that would probably send Brenda to federal prison. The irony wasn't lost on me. Her own greed and escalating threats had built the case against her better than any prosecutor could have planned. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the hum of air conditioning units working overtime, the sound of honest work keeping families comfortable in brutal heat. Tomorrow, Brenda Kensington was going to learn what real consequences looked like. Wednesday afternoon, Detective Rodriguez's office smelled like burnt coffee and justice about to be served. Bob Richardson sat across from the detective's desk, laptop open, looking like a forensic accountant who'd just discovered the financial equivalent of buried treasure. "Gentlemen," Rodriguez said, spreading our evidence across his desk like a general planning a siege, "what you've stumbled onto here is way bigger than neighborhood harassment. This is organized fraud with federal implications." Bob's fingers danced across his keyboard, pulling up a spreadsheet that would make the FBI's white-collar crime unit weep with envy. "I've traced every fraudulent payment over 14 months. 7 residents paid fake fines totaling $3,200, all deposited into accounts controlled by Brenda Kensington." Rodriguez nodded, but his expression suggested he was holding back the real bombshell. "That's just the tip of the iceberg." He pulled out a thick file folder that landed on his desk with the weight of impending doom. "I ran a background check on your neighbor. Turns out Brenda's financial situation makes the Titanic look seaworthy." The afternoon sun slanted through his office windows, casting long shadows that seemed to emphasize the gravity of what we were about to learn. Outside, I could hear the distant drone of traffic mixed with the mechanical hum of the building's air conditioning, a sound that always reminds me that even in the middle of serious business, someone's got to keep the world cool. "Her husband's import business didn't just fail," Rodriguez continued, opening the file. "It collapsed, owing $340,000 to creditors. Mortgage 4 months behind, Mercedes lease in default, credit cards maxed at $52,000. She's been using your fake HOA fines to make minimum payments and keep the repo man from turning her life into a country song." But here's where the story took a turn that made my divorce drama look like a children's birthday party. "Ms. Kensington has been running this exact scam for over 3 years, Rodriguez said, pulling out police reports from Scottsdale. "Same fake violations, same fraudulent collection methods, same targeting of working-class residents who might not fight back." Bob's eyes went wide. "She's done this before." "Gets better. Scottsdale PD was building a case against her in 2022 when she conveniently disappeared, moved to your neighborhood, and started fresh." Rodriguez leaned forward. "But here's the kicker, and this is what's going to put her away for a long time." He pulled out a photograph that made my stomach drop. It showed Brenda's hands holding a USPS master key, the kind that opens entire neighborhood mailbox clusters. She's been intercepting legitimate HOA communications and replacing them with her fake violations. We're talking mail theft, identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud across state lines. The room fell silent except for the buzz of fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of Phoenix traffic. I could feel my pulse in my temples as the full scope of what we'd uncovered hit me. "How much money are we talking about total?" I asked. Rodriguez consulted his notes. "Between Scottsdale and your neighborhood, conservative estimate is $15,000 over 3 years, but the federal charges carry 20-year sentences because she crossed state lines and used postal services to commit fraud." Bob closed his laptop with a satisfied click. "So what happens now?" "Now?" Rodriguez smiled for the first time since we'd met. "Now I get arrest warrants, and we shut down a multi-year criminal enterprise that's been masquerading as neighborhood drama." Walking out of that police station felt like stepping into a different world. For months, Brenda had made me question my own sanity, wondering if I was overreacting to simple neighbor disputes. Turns out I'd been the target of a sophisticated criminal operation. Bob and I stood in the parking lot where the asphalt was already starting to shimmer in the afternoon heat. "You realize what this means?" he said. "That justice is about to be served with a side of federal prison time?" "Better than that," Bob grinned. "Brenda Kensington just went from neighborhood bully to federal defendant, and she has absolutely no idea what's coming." My phone buzzed. Another anonymous threat text. This time I actually laughed out loud. "Too little, too late, Brenda. Way too late." Friday evening, Janet Mueller's dining room looked like the FBI had set up a field office in suburban Arizona. We'd transformed her antique oak table into mission control for what Detective Rodriguez cheerfully called dismantling a multi-year fraud enterprise, which sounds way cooler than getting revenge on the crazy neighbor lady. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with Janet's vanilla candles and the faint scent of Bob Richardson's stress sweat as he hunched over his laptop like a forensic accountant having the best day of his professional life. "All right, people," Rodriguez said, settling into Janet's floral dining chair and spreading out enough paperwork to deforest a small country. "Federal prosecutors want this case bulletproof before we move to arrest. That means every piece of evidence needs to be cataloged, cross-referenced, and organized like we're building a case against Al Capone." Bob had created what he proudly termed the Brenda Prosecution Package, a color-coded filing system that would make the Library of Congress jealous. Green folders for fraudulent violations, red for threatening communications, blue for financial crimes, and yellow for what he called aggravated suburban terrorism. Here's something most people don't know about federal fraud cases, and this is knowledge I picked up from watching my divorce lawyer work. Prosecutors love cases where the defendant has basically built the evidence against themselves. Brenda's obsessive documentation of her own crimes was going to make the FBI's job embarrassingly easy. "Janet," Rodriguez continued, "you're our community witness coordinator. I need signed statements from every victim, every neighbor who witnessed intimidation, and anyone who can testify about her behavioral patterns." Janet nodded, already 2 pages deep into a victim contact list that read like a phone book of suburban trauma. 12 households got fake violations, 6 more witnessed threats or harassment, and 3 neighbors can testify about her intercepting mail. Detective Sarah Olivia from White Collar Crime had joined our little suburban crime-fighting squad, bringing federal credentials and the kind of prosecutorial enthusiasm that suggested she genuinely enjoyed sending fraudsters to prison. "Cases like this are prosecutor gold," Olivia explained, reviewing Bob's financial analysis with obvious satisfaction. "Clear intent, documented pattern, multiple victims across state lines. It's what we call a career-ending slam dunk in the federal system." She spread out a neighborhood map, marking each targeted household with colored pins. The visual pattern was devastating. Brenda had systematically hunted newer residents, single parents, elderly folks, and anyone who looked like they might pay a bogus fine rather than fight City Hall. "Textbook predator methodology," Olivia noted, photographing the pin map. "She profiles for vulnerability, uses official-looking intimidation, and relies on victims being too embarrassed or confused to report fraud." Lisa Santos, still clutching her canceled check like evidence in a murder trial, raised her hand. "What happens to people like me who actually paid her fake fines?" "Asset forfeiture and victim restitution," Rodriguez explained. "We freeze her accounts, seize her assets, and every victim gets compensated, plus interest." The evening desert wind rattled Janet's windows while Bob's calculator clicked away like a mechanical heartbeat. Outside, you could hear the normal sounds of suburban life: kids playing, lawn mowers running, the distant hum of air conditioning units working overtime in Arizona heat. Rodriguez pulled out his phone and showed us photos that looked like evidence from a spy thriller. Search warrant executed this afternoon. We found letterhead templates, fake company stamps, P.O. box keys she wasn't authorized to possess, and financial records documenting fraud across 2 counties. "How much money total?" I asked. "Conservative estimate, $18,000 over 3 years, with potential tax evasion charges adding another dimension." Chen opened her briefcase and pulled out legal documents thick enough to use as doorstops. "Wire fraud carries 20 years maximum, mail fraud is another 20, identity theft adds mandatory minimums. We're looking at potential decades in federal prison." Here's something that divorce court taught me about legal strategy. Timing is everything. The federal government doesn't move fast, but when they do move, it's with the subtlety of a freight train hitting a smart car. "Arrest is scheduled for Monday, 6 a.m., Rodriguez announced. "Federal agents, local backup, media notification for public awareness." "Media?" Janet looked like she'd just been told we were having dinner with the president. "HOA fraud affects thousands of homeowners annually," Olivia explained. "Your case becomes a public service announcement that could prevent future victims nationwide." As we organized evidence into prosecution-ready packages, Rodriguez handed each of us business cards with direct contact information. "Stay vigilant this weekend. Desperate criminals make unpredictable moves when they sense walls closing in." Bob closed his laptop with the satisfied click of a man who'd just helped build an airtight federal case. "You know what the beautiful irony is? Brenda's been so focused on harassing us that she never realized we were documenting every crime she committed." Walking to my truck in the desert evening air, that distinctive blend of sagebrush and cooling asphalt that defines Arizona nights, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my divorce finalized. Not just relief, but genuine anticipation. My phone buzzed with another anonymous threat text. This time I actually smiled while forwarding it to Rodriguez. Monday morning, Brenda Kensington was going to wake up to federal agents at her door and realize that karma doesn't just knock. Sometimes it kicks the door down with a search warrant. Saturday morning started peacefully enough. I was in my garage, organizing tools and enjoying the brief window of cool air before Arizona's daily attempt to melt everything, when my phone rang. "Marcus, it's Janet. You need to see this." 20 minutes later, I'm standing in Janet's driveway staring at what looked like the aftermath of a vindictive teenager's revenge fantasy. Someone had egged her house, spray-painted "liar" across her garage door in neon orange letters, and scattered her garbage across the front lawn like confetti from hell. "Security camera caught it," Janet said, holding up her phone. The footage showed a figure in dark clothing and a baseball cap methodically vandalizing her property around 3 a.m. The person was careful to avoid showing their face, but that silver Mercedes parked half a block away was pretty much a neon sign screaming Brenda Kensington was here. "She's escalating," I said, taking photos of the damage. "Cornered animals get desperate." But Brenda was just getting started with her weekend crime spree. Bob Richardson called an hour later, his usually calm accountant voice tight with anger. "Someone called my former employer claiming I was embezzling client funds and suggested they investigate my pension payments. Lisa Santos got hit next. Anonymous complaints to Child Protective Services claiming she was neglecting her 8-year-old son and using drugs. CPS showed up at her house Saturday afternoon, requiring her to prove she wasn't a danger to her own child. The caseworker was actually apologetic," Lisa told us during an emergency meeting at my house that evening. "Said they get bogus reports all the time, but they're legally required to investigate. Took 3 hours to clear everything up." The pattern was obvious and increasingly unhinged. Brenda had moved beyond fake HOA violations into full-scale character assassination, using government agencies as weapons against anyone who'd joined our coalition. But here's where her desperation started working against her, and this is something my divorce lawyer taught me about opponents who lose their cool. When people panic, they make mistakes. Big, trackable, prosecutable mistakes. Sunday morning brought the piece de resistance of Brenda's meltdown. I'm having coffee on my back patio, enjoying the desert sunrise and planning a quiet day before tomorrow's arrest, when my phone explodes with notifications. She'd created fake social media profiles and posted warnings about our criminal conspiracy in every local Facebook group she could find. According to Brenda's online manifesto, we were running an elaborate insurance scam, intimidating senior citizens, and possibly involved in drug trafficking. The posts were unhinged enough to be entertaining, but they contained enough personal information about our addresses, work schedules, and family situations to cross the line into stalking and harassment. "She's basically building the prosecution's case for them," Bob observed when we all gathered at Janet's house, now sporting a fresh coat of primer over the spray paint vandalism. Every fake complaint, every threatening message, every social media post is documented evidence. Detective Rodriguez arrived with a grim expression and a folder thick with new complaints. "Your neighbor had a busy weekend. False reports to 4 different agencies, property vandalism, cyberstalking, and what appears to be attempted witness intimidation." "Attempted?" Janet asked. "She tried to bribe Doris Fleming with $500 cash to recant her statement about being pressured to file false complaints." The absurdity was breathtaking. Brenda had offered to pay someone to lie about being forced to lie in the first place. Even by the standards of suburban crime drama, this was impressively stupid. But Rodriguez wasn't done with his weekend update. She also called my captain, claiming police corruption and demanding the investigation be transferred to internal affairs. "Did that work?" I asked. Rodriguez smiled grimly. "My captain forwarded her complaint to the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. They're now very interested in meeting Ms. Kensington tomorrow morning." That evening, as desert twilight painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, we sat on my back patio reviewing the weekend's escalation. The air conditioning units hummed their mechanical lullaby while somewhere in the distance kids played in swimming pools and families grilled dinner. Normal suburban sounds that reminded us what we were really fighting for: the right to live peacefully without being terrorized by a neighbor's criminal enterprise. "You know what the ironic thing is?" Janet said, sipping iced tea and watching the sunset. "If she'd just stopped after the first fake violation, none of this would have happened." "Sociopaths can't help themselves," Bob replied with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who'd spent 40 years analyzing human behavior through financial records. "They always escalate until someone stops them." My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You people destroyed my life. Tomorrow you'll understand what real consequences look like." I showed it to Rodriguez, who just shook his head. 24 hours, he said. "She just has to make it 24 hours without committing another felony." As if on cue, a police siren wailed in the distance, heading toward Brenda's side of the neighborhood. "Think that's related?" Janet asked. "With our luck," I replied, already reaching for my car keys. "Probably." 20 minutes later, we watched from across the street as officers arrested Brenda for attempting to break into the HOA president's house, apparently searching for evidence of our conspiracy. "Well," Rodriguez said, updating his arrest report, "she made it 23 hours and 47 minutes. Close enough. Sunday night, 11:47 p.m. I'm finally drifting off to sleep after the weekend from hell when blue and red lights start strobing through my bedroom window like some kind of psychedelic nightmare. 3 squad cars. In my driveway. Again. I stumbled outside in my pajamas to find Officer Martinez looking like he'd rather be having his wisdom teeth extracted without anesthesia than dealing with whatever fresh insanity Brenda had cooked up. "Let me guess," I said, rubbing sleep from my eyes. "Emergency call about suspicious activity?" "Emergency 911 call reporting active gunfire, domestic violence, and what the caller described as screams consistent with torture or murder," Martinez replied, reading from his notes with the weary tone of someone who'd clearly lost a bet with the universe. I gestured around my perfectly quiet cul-de-sac, where the only sounds were desert wind rustling through palm trees and the distant hum of air conditioners working overtime. "Officer, I was dead asleep. My neighbors were dead asleep. The most violent thing that happened here tonight was my battle with a fitted sheet that refuses to stay on the mattress." Martinez spent 15 minutes walking around my house with his flashlight, presumably searching for evidence of the non-existent massacre Brenda had reported. When he returned, his expression suggested he was seriously reconsidering his career choices. "Mr. Thorne, this is the 9th call we've received about your address in 12 days. All from the same complainant. All completely bogus. What happens when someone repeatedly files false emergency reports? Criminal misuse of emergency services, filing false police reports, and in extreme cases, felony charges for endangering public safety." Martinez closed his notepad with a definitive snap. "Your neighbor's building quite the criminal record with dispatch." After the patrol cars disappeared into the night, leaving my street smelling like exhaust fumes and broken dreams, I called Rodriguez. Despite being past midnight, he answered before the second ring. "She called in a mass shooting," I told him. "I know. Dispatch called me directly. We're executing the arrest warrant tonight." "Tonight? I thought you were waiting until morning." "Marcus, she's moved from fraud to emergency services abuse. The next logical escalation is actual violence. We're not taking that chance." At 2:23 a.m., I watched through my living room blinds as what looked like a small army of federal agents surrounded Brenda's house. No sirens, no Hollywood drama, just methodical professionals doing what they do best. The arrest was almost disappointingly anticlimactic. Brenda emerged in a leopard print bathrobe that had seen better decades, screaming about police state tactics and constitutional violations while being efficiently loaded into an unmarked federal sedan. Her voice echoed across the desert stillness like a wounded coyote having an existential crisis. But here's where things took a turn that nobody, and I mean nobody, saw coming. Monday morning, while processing Brenda's house, federal agents discovered something that transformed our neighborhood drama into a multi-state criminal conspiracy. Hidden in her bedroom closet, they found 3 laptops, dozens of fake identity documents, and what Detective Olivia later described as the most comprehensive fraud operation we've seen outside of organized crime. "Your neighbor wasn't just running HOA scams," Olivia explained during an emergency briefing that felt like something from a Netflix crime series. "She was operating coordinated fraud rings in retirement communities across Nevada, New Mexico, and California." Bob Richardson, clutching his calculator like a life preserver, looked up from his latest spreadsheet of financial carnage. "How many victims total?" 47 confirmed victims across 4 states. Total fraud amount approaching $127,000 over 6 years. The community center fell dead silent except for the mechanical wheeze of the air conditioning fighting Arizona heat and Janet's audible gasp of disbelief. We'd gone from dealing with a difficult neighbor to being key witnesses in what was essentially a federal racketeering case. Brenda hadn't just been targeting us. She'd been running a criminal enterprise that would make mob accountants proud. The beautiful irony, Olivia continued with obvious satisfaction, is that she documented everything. Every fake violation, every fraudulent collection, every threatening message. She basically built our entire prosecution case for us. That afternoon, Brenda made her initial court appearance via video link from federal detention. Even through the grainy courthouse camera feed, you could see she'd traded her designer lifestyle for orange jail scrubs, and the dawning realization that her criminal career had finally met its match. The federal judge took one look at the charges: wire fraud, mail fraud, identity theft, criminal conspiracy, and interstate transportation of stolen property, and denied bail faster than a Phoenix sunrise. "Flight risk and clear pattern of sophisticated criminal activity across state lines," the judge announced. "Defendant will remain in federal custody pending trial." Brenda's court-appointed attorney looked like he'd rather be defending parking violations at traffic court. Walking out of that federal courthouse into the blazing Arizona afternoon, with news crews asking for interviews about HOA fraud prevention, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this nightmare began: complete and total vindication. My phone buzzed with a text from Rodriguez. "Preliminary plea negotiations looking at 12 to 15 years federal prison. Justice served." I looked up at the desert sky where storm clouds were building for one of Arizona's rare afternoon thunder showers and actually laughed out loud. Brenda Kensington had finally picked a fight she couldn't win with the federal government, and tomorrow the whole world was going to watch her downfall. Tuesday evening, 7 p.m. sharp, the Willowbrook Estates Community Center had been transformed into something between a town hall meeting and a circus, packed with residents, news crews, and enough drama to fuel a Netflix series. I walked in expecting maybe 20 neighbors and found what looked like half of Phoenix crammed into folding chairs. Local news had turned our HOA fraud story into a cautionary tale about suburban crime, and apparently everyone wanted front row seats to the finale. Detective Rodriguez sat at the head table with a stack of evidence folders thick enough to stop bullets, flanked by FBI agent Olivia and our property management company's very nervous-looking regional manager. The smell of industrial coffee mixed with nervous sweat, and that particular scent of anticipation you get when justice is about to be publicly served. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rodriguez began, his voice carrying over the crowd like he was announcing a prize fight, "we're here tonight to discuss the resolution of a federal criminal investigation that began right here in your neighborhood." That's when the community center doors burst open like something from a courtroom drama. Brenda Kensington's attorney, a private lawyer she'd apparently hired with money nobody knew she had, strutted in with his client trailing behind him like a defeated general. Brenda was out on emergency bail pending appeal, wearing what looked like a designer suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. Her hair was perfect, her makeup flawless, and her expression suggested she still believed she could talk her way out of federal charges. "My client," the lawyer announced to the packed room, "is here tonight to set the record straight about false accusations and police misconduct." You could feel the collective intake of breath from 200 people who'd been waiting months to see this woman finally face consequences for her crimes. Rodriguez stood up, and I swear the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "Ms. Kensington, you're welcome to speak, but I should inform you and this community that federal prosecutors have accepted your guilty plea on 12 counts of wire fraud, 8 counts of mail fraud, and conspiracy to commit interstate fraud." The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Guilty plea, federal charges, interstate fraud conspiracy. Brenda's face went through more color changes than a mood ring having a seizure. There were extenuating circumstances." "Ma'am," Rodriguez interrupted, pulling out a document that looked thick enough to be a small novel. "Would you like me to read the list of charges you pleaded guilty to yesterday in federal court?" Agent Olivia stood up. And when FBI agents stand up in public meetings, people pay attention. For the benefit of the community, Ms. Kensington's crimes include defrauding 47 victims across 4 states, stealing over $127,000 through fake HOA violations, identity theft, mail fraud, and witness intimidation. The room erupted. Neighbors who'd been terrorized by Brenda's fake violations started shouting questions. News cameras swiveled to capture reactions, and somewhere in the chaos, you could hear Brenda's voice getting shriller as she tried to maintain her innocence. "This is a witch hunt! These people conspired against me! I was just trying to maintain neighborhood standards!" That's when Bob Richardson stood up, clutching his laptop like a weapon of mathematical destruction. "Neighborhood standards?" he said, his accountant voice carrying clearly over the noise. "You stole $3,200 from our neighbors alone, created 47 fake violations, and filed false police reports 17 times. Janet Mueller joined him, holding up a folder of victim statements. "You terrorized 12 families, made Lisa Santos afraid to let her son play outside, and convinced elderly residents they were criminals for planting tomatoes in their own yards." But here's the moment that made the whole ordeal worth it. The mic-drop moment that every victim of bureaucratic bullying dreams about. I stood up in the back of the room, and something about the way the crowd quieted told me this was my time to speak. "Brenda, you spent months trying to convince everyone that I was the problem, that I was disrupting neighborhood harmony, intimidating senior citizens, and threatening property values." She turned to face me, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw something in her eyes that looked like genuine fear. "But you know what the real problem was?" I continued, my voice carrying to every corner of the packed room. "The real problem was that you turned our neighborhood into your personal ATM, terrorized families trying to live their lives, and used law enforcement as your personal attack dogs." The crowd was dead silent now, hanging on every word. "The real crime wasn't the $127,000 you stole from victims across 4 states. It wasn't even the fake violations or the threatening phone calls." I paused, looking directly at her as cameras captured every second. "The real crime was destroying the trust that makes communities work. But here's the beautiful thing about trust. When good people work together, it can be rebuilt." Rodriguez stepped forward with what looked like an official sentencing document. "Brenda Kensington, federal court has sentenced you to 8 years in prison, full restitution to all victims, and a lifetime ban from serving in any HOA capacity." The room exploded in applause that sounded like thunder rolling across the Arizona desert. As federal marshals escorted Brenda from the community center, past news cameras, past neighbors she'd terrorized, past the justice she'd spent years avoiding, her lawyer leaned over and whispered something in her ear. Whatever he said made her turn back one last time and look directly at me. I smiled and waved goodbye. Justice, as they say, is a dish best served with federal prison time. 6 months later, I'm standing in my driveway on a Saturday morning watching the moving truck pull away from Brenda's old house. The new owners, a young couple with twin toddlers, wave from their front porch as their kids chase each other around the yard, filling the space with the kind of laughter that had been missing from our neighborhood for way too long. The legal aftermath played out exactly like Detective Rodriguez predicted. Brenda served 18 months in federal prison before being released on supervised probation, during which she paid full restitution to every victim across 4 states. The Mercedes got repoed, the designer lifestyle got liquidated, and last I heard she was working at a call center in Tucson under strict financial monitoring. But here's what really mattered, what we built after she was gone. The Willowbrook Community Coalition, which started as our little group of fraud victims, became something bigger. We created the first resident-funded HOA oversight committee in Pima County, complete with independent financial auditing and transparent violation procedures that actually follow the law. Bob Richardson, turns out, was born to be a community organizer. He developed a simple checklist that HOA residents across Arizona now use to verify legitimate enforcement actions. The Richardson Protocol, as property management companies call it, has prevented an estimated $50,000 in fraud attempts statewide. Janet Mueller started hosting monthly new neighbor welcome gatherings, where we actually explain people's rights instead of terrorizing them with fake violations. These events have become so popular that other neighborhoods are copying the model. Lisa Santos, who'd been too scared to let her son play outside during Brenda's reign of terror, now runs our Community Kids Activities program. Last month's talent show in the community center had 93 participants and raised $2,400 for local school programs. The real victory, though, was watching our neighborhood transform from a place where people were afraid of their neighbors into something that actually felt like a community. Doris Fleming, the sweet elderly lady Brenda had manipulated into filing false complaints, became our unofficial neighborhood historian. She organized a community garden where people actually talk to each other instead of reporting each other for imaginary violations. The Willowbrook Community Fund we established with recovered fraud money has provided 3 trade school scholarships, emergency assistance for 2 families facing medical bills, and funding for the annual block party that's become legendary in our area. My business, Reliable Climate Repair, grew by 40% through word-of-mouth referrals from neighbors who appreciated having someone willing to stand up to bullies. I hired 2 employees and bought a second truck, which I park proudly in my driveway every night without worrying about fake violations. The personal stuff worked out too. Janet's sister Carol moved to Phoenix last year and we've been dating for 8 months. Turns out surviving suburban warfare together is pretty good relationship preparation. She thinks it's hilarious that I met her family by helping prosecute a federal criminal. The media attention led to something we never expected. State legislators contacted us about strengthening HOA oversight laws. The Willowbrook Act passed last month, requiring HOA management companies to implement fraud prevention protocols and giving residents clearer legal recourse against harassment. But my favorite outcome happened just last week. I got a call from a guy in Flagstaff whose HOA president was pulling the same fake violation scam Brenda had perfected. Instead of feeling helpless and isolated, he'd found our story online and knew exactly what to do. "I've got all the evidence documented," he told me. "Just called the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. Thought you'd want to know your story helped stop another fraud before it got worse." That's when I realized what we'd really accomplished. We didn't just stop one criminal. We created a template for communities to protect themselves. These days, when I come home from work and park my truck in the driveway, the smell of desert sage mixing with barbecue smoke from someone's backyard doesn't remind me of harassment and fake violations. It smells like home. My phone's buzzing now with a text from Bob. "Community meeting tonight at 7, discussing the new playground proposal. Also, Channel 12 wants to do a follow-up story on the Willowbrook model spreading to other states." I'm looking forward to both. If you've survived your own HOA nightmare, drop your story in the comments below. Seriously, some of these tales make Brenda look like an amateur, and I read every single one. Your experience might help the next person facing down a neighborhood tyrant. And make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because next week I'm telling you about the time our new HOA president tried to embezzle the pool renovation funds and learned why you should never mess with a community that's already been through federal court together. Trust me, that story's even crazier than this one.
From all of us here at HOA Stories, thanks so much for watching today's HOA Karen Meltdown. If you enjoyed seeing neighbors stand their ground and karma catch up, smash that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe so you won't miss the next HOA drama we bring you.